one and all, and welcome to my channel, Sermon Time, where I am your host, Tony Jasper. In March and April of this year, my wife and I took a fabulous trip to the Bible lands of Egypt and Jordan and Israel. And upon returning to the States, I decided I would share with you a bit of what I learned while I was there. There were so many things we took in such a short period of time that I needed time to digest it all. So I've undertaken this sermon series, The Truth of Our Bibles Tour. Today's message, based on a story Jesus told, was one example of how our experiences in Israel yielded valuable insights into the Bible. I've entitled this message, The Vine of Christ. And like everything else we have shared, it proves the stories of the Bible are authentic. Here's Jesus' parable of the vine dressers from Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. Hear another parable. There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. And when vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they may receive its fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did likewise to them. Then last of all, he sent his son to them, saying, They will respect my son. But when the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance. So they took him, cast him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine dressers? They said to him, He will destroy those wicked men miserably, and lease his vineyard to other vine dressers who will render to him the fruits of their seasons. Now, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking of them. But when they sought to lay hands on him, they feared the multitudes because they took him for a prophet. So you have this landowner, and he wanted to have a vineyard, so he plants one, puts a hedge around it, digs a wine press for it, then builds a tower. Now, the hedge was there to protect the vineyard from animals and human damage and things like that. That's clear enough. And situating a wine press on site makes sense, so you don't have to preserve the grapes or transport them long distances. You can just make wine immediately. I get all that. But what in the world is the tower for? Vine dressers tend to the vines and their fruit. They prune unnecessary branches and leaves and pick the fruits when they're ripe. But what does the guy in the tower do? Why include this detail in the story at all? And I have no definitive answer to that. Is he referring to the role that ancient watchmen played in the city walls? Is this a vestige of Adam and Eve's garden with the angel guarding the way to the tree of life? Maybe. Or is there some other reason altogether? In either case, it becomes clear the purpose of the story is to ensure his listeners produce fruit. Good fruit. Not wild fruit, but good fruit when the season is right for it. This is where our trip to Israel comes in. One of the places we visited was Nazareth. Nazareth was, as you will recall, where Jesus grew up after he and his family returned from their hiding in Egypt. Now, in our trips to the Bible lands, we visited Jesus' two homes in Egypt. But it was our trip to Nazareth that yielded valuable insights into this parable Jesus told of the vineyard. An organization known as the Nazareth Trust has reenacted what life was like back in the 1st century A.D., time when Jesus grew up there. Back in the day, they would have had potters shaping their clay pots on their foot-driven turntables. Pottery bakers would operate the kiln. You had yarn dyers and fabric makers. There were mill grinders, olive oil press operators, carpenters with all their specialty tools. And of course, you had fishermen and many other hard-working people. When the Nazareth Trust bought this land to create its replica of first century Nazareth, what they didn't know was that the property had an ancient vineyard on it. And they knew it was a vineyard based on many evidences. First, there were terraces built into the hillside indicating agricultural purposes for the land. Second, you had the presence of a wine press below the grapevines, and a groove in the rock at the bottom of the press for juice to run down. There was a place to catch the juice below the groove. And this is where ladies or gentlemen would catch the wine and prepare it for preservation. And then you had evidence number 5, a structure to the upper left in this picture, the watchtower. This tower was not rebuilt. It was there on the property when they bought it. It was in this shape from the beginning. Jesus, who grew up in Nazareth and probably played on this very hillside in Nazareth, would have been privy to the watchtower. Not all vineyards had these, but the one in Nazareth did. When Jesus told his story about the vineyard, it had a watchtower in it. Remember verse 33? There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. There's the tower. It makes you wonder if this was the vineyard Jesus had in mind when he told this story. Standing there in the presence of a vineyard with a watchtower in the childhood town Jesus grew up in gave me chills up and down my spine. Of course, as with everything in the Bible, there's so much more depth to the story. You will recall that after Jesus told this story, the chief priests and Pharisees perceived that he was speaking of them. This wasn't just a hunch. There was a reason they thought he was referring to them. You see, they knew their Bibles. And as Jesus told his story, it reminded them of this passage in the Old Testament where very similar picture is given in a passage in Isaiah. And that passage tells you who the vineyard represents. The passage is Isaiah 5, verses 1 to 7. And as I read it, see if you can't pick out the similarities in these two stories and who it was that Jesus said is represented by the vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up, cleared out its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes. But it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold oppression. For righteousness, but behold a cry for help. Did you pick out the similarities? The landowner planting a vineyard with a hedge and a wine press and a tower. This isn't a coincidence. And what did the landowner expect in both stories? Good fruit. But instead it produced wild grapes unsuitable for anything. Here the prophecy foretells destruction of the vineyard. And who's the vineyard? The vineyard represents God's people in Israel and Judah. Since the elements of Jesus' story are so similar to the elements in Isaiah's story, it is no wonder the priests and Pharisees perceived he was talking of them, and the destruction that was coming on Israel because of their poor treatment of the vineyard. And Jesus' story adds the killing of the messengers and the son of the landowner as its most grievous crime. The elements in Isaiah's prophecy are all explained. The landowners are God and his beloved Son. And the whole idea of the vineyard the Lord planted has to do with his expectations for his people Israel. He wanted them to be fruitful, to bear sweet fruit for the inhabitants of the earth to enjoy as they learned about the goodness of God throughout Israel. And to produce such good fruit, the vine dressers would have to faithfully prune and train and nourish and care for the vineyard. Otherwise, wild grapes would result that were good for nothing. So who are these vine dressers? Well, they are the ones entrusted with caring for the vineyard. They tend the garden, guard the garden, fertilize the garden, hone it, perfect it. The vine dressers are your pastors and elders and deacons and deaconesses and teachers and other messengers and care providers in the congregation. Now in Jesus' day, the care providers of the vineyard didn't do so hot, did they? Instead of caring for the vineyard and producing a harvest that would honor the landowner, in Jesus' story, they determined that the vineyard actually belonged to them. Any attempt from the landowner or the servants he sent as messengers, or even his son to direct or warn or demand anything from the vine dressers was met with hostility. They beat them, killed them, and stoned them. When a second battalion of messengers were sent, they received the same treatment. So finally the landowner sends his son, thinking, surely they'll respect my son. But when the son came, they killed him in hopes of taking away ownership of the vineyard from the intended beneficiary. Jesus asked the question, and this is where he brings home the message of Isaiah. What do you think the landowner is going to do to those vine dressers? And without a blink, they answer. This is what he should do. He will destroy those wicked men miserably. Now, I have no idea how a person destroys something else or somebody else wonderfully. Isn't it only possible to destroy someone miserably? Anyway, you get the point. It's going to end very, very badly for them. Jesus continues, and he will lease his vineyard to those other vine dressers who will render him the fruit in their seasons. This is a pretty stiff rebuke. The Jews claimed that Judaism belonged to them and nobody else. Gentiles were not welcome. Even those who converted to Judaism were considered as kind of second-class members of the church. They had names for these Gentile would-be Jews. They called them proselytes and God-fearers. Proselytes were believers in the true God who kept the Ten Commandments and the Mosaic Law. God-fearers, on the other hand, had believed in the true God but only kept the Ten Commandments. They didn't keep the Mosaic Law. They didn't participate in the temple services at all, not the feasts or anything. And the men weren't circumcised. In either case, converted Gentiles did not enjoy all the privileges of Israel, at least natural-born Israel. So when Jesus says the vineyard would be taken from the Jews and given to another, he was treading on holy ground. He was telling them, your nation is about to be destroyed because you're plotting to kill God's Son. And before they committed this terrible act against God, he sends them several warnings in the form of parables that they perceived referred to them. And they did. And they did it anyway. Matthew 22:15 tells us, the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. His talk proved his position to be superior to theirs, and the people were astonished at this. Again and again in the chapters that follow, Jesus confounded the leaders, proving he was God. In Matthew 23, he lands 7 woes upon them for the hard-heartedness and hypocrisy, and then he declares in verse 38, your house is left to you desolate. The vineyard was from that point forward slated for destruction. They had crossed a bridge they could not return from. The gospel and the kingdom it proclaimed would go to the Gentiles. And how this riled them. 4 chapters later, they killed him, nailing him to a cross and sealing their doom by fulfilling the very prophecy that predicted it. What could we possibly learn from this tragic story? Well, I've got 3 suggested takeaways. First, God expects results from his people. He has a purpose for his vineyard. He has made sure we have everything we need to succeed. He has nurtured us, saved us, transformed us, empowered us, and sent us out. But we have to decide to succeed. We have to put in the work. We have to invest our blood and sweat and tears and do it in such a way that it honors the landowner who made it all possible. He wants good fruit, and we have to produce it. Second, unlike the vine dressers in Jesus' story, we can never think we own this vineyard. It is his church, not ours. We are not owners, but tenants. We are care providers. We do not dictate how the church is to operate, how services are to be performed, how ministries are to be carried out in their various responsibilities. We care for this place in his stead, or at least we ought to. But we are not the sole deciders on how things ought to be. But know this, those who neglect their work or do it poorly, or hold this sense of ownership and entitlement that this endeavor we call the Church of God is somehow theirs and ought to follow their own ideas or peculiar notions, well, such influences are slated for destruction. The call Jesus gives us is to remain faithful to him and his purposes for us, to do what he has laid on us to do with fidelity. We cannot employ methods of cruelty or deception or nasty attitudes. We cannot force or manipulate or any such thing because, well, these are contrary to his ways. We have work to do, and we need to do it faithfully and in tandem together in the way that he approves. We are both the vineyard and the vine dressers here, and we all have to work together for the vine to thrive. The third insight, takeaway that I have from this story is, as we recall, the landowner went away to a far country a long time ago. But Jesus is coming back soon. And if Jesus' words are true, when he does, he will judge the quality of our work and the spirit in which we carried it out. We need an active watchtower in the vineyard. It needs to be manned by those who have the good of the vineyard in mind, to protect it, to manage it, to tend to it so that it flourishes. We want to see multitudes of good fruit. People, many people, saved because of our efforts here. And in the end, as we work hard to work together to save the lost, not shun the lost, not block the lost out, but share our sweet fruit with them, then Jesus will be honored, and our vineyard will accomplish what he designed it should. So my message to vine dressers is this: take care of the vine. The Bible calls us all to care one for another. Apparently, we'll be judged on how well we carry that out. May God bless us as we do our part by giving, by speaking, by doing, by investing sweat equity, by encouraging, by instructing, by feeding, by showing kindness, by building up and not tearing down, by doing the thousands of things God's people do every day, everywhere, to spread the good news of his kingdom to any and all who will have it. And when Jesus comes, may it be our privilege to hear his encouraging words, "Well done, good and faithful servants." Until next week, God be with you all.